So let's dig in. Today's topic is DORA. Dane, for those of our viewers who are not aware, could you share with them the DORA regulatory framework and what it's going to be doing for businesses in the EU and globally when it comes into effect?
Yeah, absolutely. So DORA is the Digital Operation Resiliency Act out of the EU, specifically targeting the financial services businesses within the EU. The central bank did a tabletop exercise a little while ago, and as a result of that, 70% of the financial institutions in the EU unfortunately failed. So there was a real focus around how do we ensure that we're protecting our financial interest, our financial assets, and our customers and company reputation into the future. So DORA was born out of that. So it's putting the legislation in place that has, for the first time, some serious teeth in it around making sure that organizations understand the risk and are mitigating that risk.
When you say that the Digital Operations Resiliency Act will increase the enforcement, sort of increase the penalties and put some teeth in it, what does that look like, and what is DORA replacing that's currently in effect? I mean, we're not starting with a blank slate in terms of regulation. How is DORA different?
From a DORA perspective, we're entering a period of comply or else, rather than comply or explain. This really reminds me of when the US introduced the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002, after some high-profile financial scandals, WorldCom, Enron, and the like. And Section 4 of that act made management responsible for a system of internal control. And this makes me feel very much similar to DORA, where we really putting the onus on management to make sure that resiliency is top of mind and make sure that we implement those correct controls.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what we're now seeing is that resiliency is a key component at the C-suite level. And this is bringing it to the front of those conversations where the legislation, where the regulation is pinned by significant fines and potentially jail time for those that don't comply. And I can see that that is going to be a trend that is replicated around the world. And so it doesn't matter, we've got people sitting here from all over the world. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting in India, Australia, America. If you're doing business in the EU, you have to be compliant. There is no getting around because I have my headquarters somewhere else.
Obviously, DORA is going to affect the day-to-day operations of financial services institutions, in particular around how they protect data, around their general IT security, and around their resilience practices. Can you unpack that a little bit and talk about what the actual changes on the ground are likely to be?
But fortunately, most financial institutions are not starting from scratch. So that's there at least. But the scope has been extended to such an extent that there might be organizations that are not as mature as the most mature banks that are out there from a governance perspective or from a resilience perspective. So we really need to make sure that, previous risk assessments or whatever the case may be, is updated with the latest digital transformations that are taking place within organizations. And that means that operational teams would have to get more strict on their cybersecurity governance. How do we get IT and security and resilience to work together with C-suite to make sure that we've got a cohesive plan? We'll have to enhance cybersecurity protocols, so continuous monitoring will be the norm. We'll have to have near real-time insight in what's happening on the ground so that we can react to that. We will have to have better vulnerability management systems so that those patches that can take 6 months to deploy get deployed sooner, But I think especially two key elements is that incident reporting and response will now require dedicated teams. It would be IT, security, legal, management, the executives all have to work together to make sure this plan is executable to get you back to where you need to be on your worst day. And then together with that, I think a big difference or a big change is also that we now have to worry about third-party risk management. So all those vendor assessments that we have to get done, we have to look at our SLAs with our service partners, and we have to get the contracts updated to make sure that DORA is integrated into those plans as well. Not to mention, encryption, access controls, training. I won't go through that, all those in detail now, but I think, as Dan said earlier, that technical debt would need to be serviced. We will need to get the security technologies in place and the upgrades to IT infrastructures to make this not just adequate, but to make it effective as well. And I think from a cost perspective, that's going to be key.
So let me unpack, Andre, a little bit of that, and then we'll lead into the next question that I have for Dane. You mentioned we're going to have to go to continuous monitoring and continuous response. Now, as an ex-auditor, I think what you're highlighting is the difference between perhaps older 10 or 20 years ago audit checkbox compliance behavior versus the compliance behavior that DORA is going to require, which is really going to be affecting your day-to-day operations. Is that what you're pointing out?
Indeed. We will need to have our finger on the pulse of what's happening within the network, but how do we identify that something is anomalous? So we'll need to drill this, we'll need to test this, we'll need to do tabletop exercises, but we'll also need to dive a little bit deeper to make sure that we can act when it is appropriate to do so.
Yeah, and not just as an IT problem, but cross-functionally, corporate communications, legal, risk management, et cetera. What risk management strategies do you expect to see changing in order for financial services organizations that are subject to DORA? What do you see them changing? What specific changes do you see coming down the line?
I think a lot more of that visibility that we saw when we talked about earlier. I think that the continuous improvement and thinking about, from a Kyndryl perspective, we talk about minimum viable company. Where are those golden assets within your data framework that require the application to be available? Recovering the data is well and good, but unless the application is there to support it, you don't have a real business. So looking at it down, where is the data residing? What are the applications that support that data or leverage that data into the customers? And more importantly, what does the minimum viable company look like? So having that continuous monitoring and continuous testing and securing of those assets, I think will change the field dramatically. And I know that where we have a hybrid environment where customers are running, workloads on-prem and in the cloud, or, even in the cloud solely, I think there is going to be a lot more testing and ensuring that the recoverability of this data is actually going to happen.
Let's talk briefly now about disaster recovery. If an organization maybe is still doing their disaster recovery plan old school, and they're going to be subject to DORA, or as you point out, to NIS2 going forward, what specific changes are we going to see around disaster recovery preparation that folks will be implementing?
Look, I think we need to address some things that DORA has brought up. So standardized reporting framework. So we want uniform reporting criteria consistent across the financial sector. That's going to be a toughie for a lot of organizations that are not as mature as maybe, the biggest banks in the world, whatever the case may be. And also to get to those defined reporting timelines. We're talking 24 to 72 hours for initial notification. So we need to identify the incident, we need to organize ourselves, we need to protect ourselves, and then start that reporting framework going forward. Mandatory reporting to authorities. All these things will be quite difficult to do if we don't have a mature incident response, a disaster recovery plan in place. And I think, and then for detailed reporting requirements, we look at incident reports, that are now dictated by the DORA Act. So we have to provide those continuous updates as the outage is dealt with. So there's a lot to be done, to make sure that there's an efficient response.